In 1855, a 16-year-old boy in Cleveland walked into a stationery shop and spent 10 cents on a small red notebook. On the cover, he wrote 2 letters, Ledger A. For the rest of his life, every penny he earned and every penny he spent went into that book and its successors. 40 years later, the habit recorded in those notebooks had built an empire that controlled 90% of America's oil, crushed every competitor that tried to stand in its way, made him the world's first confirmed billionaire, and turned him into the most hated man in the United States. Here's the part most people miss. The empire wasn't built by a tycoon. It wasn't built by a salesman, a charismatic visionary, or a daring risk-taker. It was built by a bookkeeper. The most dangerous man in 19th century America wasn't a robber baron with a cigar. He was an accountant with a God complex. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, told from inside the ledger. If you find untold business history stories like this one valuable, hit subscribe before we go further. New videos every week. The single best way to support the channel is to like the video and tell YouTube what you want more of. Section 1. The father who taught him never to trust anyone. To understand the bookkeeper, you have to understand the father. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a small farming town in upstate New York called Richford. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist who lived by hard work, honesty, and faith. His father was William Avery Rockefeller, known to everyone who'd ever been swindled by him as Devil Bill. Devil Bill made his living as a traveling salesman. That was the cover story. The reality was that he was a con artist of an unusually cold kind. He sold bottles of colored water to dying farmers, telling them it was a cure for cancer. He pretended to be a deaf-mute beggar so people would speak openly around him, then use the information he overheard to ruin them later. He didn't just take their money. By every account, he enjoyed it, and he treated his own family the same way. One of the most told stories about John's childhood comes from his father directly. Devil Bill once placed young John on a high chair, told him to jump, and promised to catch him. The boy jumped. The father stepped aside. John hit the floor. The lesson, Devil Bill explained, was simple. Trust no one, not even me. In 1849, Devil Bill's other life began catching up with him. He was accused of a serious crime in his home county and quietly fled across the border. He took a new name, Dr. William Livingston, married a second woman while still legally married to Eliza, and lived a complete double life for the next 50 years. He left his original family in poverty. John was 12 when his father vanished. By 16, he was effectively the head of the household. He took 2 things from his father into adulthood. The first was a worldview, that the world was a battlefield and softness was a tax you couldn't afford to pay. The second was a deep, almost religious commitment that nobody, in any way, would ever take anything from him without his permission. The first thing he bought after his father disappeared was the red notebook. At 16, John enrolled in a 3-month bookkeeping course at a commercial college in Cleveland. He landed his first job almost immediately, as an assistant bookkeeper at a produce shipping firm, earning 50 cents a day. Most teenagers in his position would have spent the money on small pleasures. John recorded every cent in Ledger A: income, lunch, lamp oil, charity. Every transaction in his life, no matter how small, ended up in a column of his book by sundown. He gave 10% of every paycheck to his Baptist church. He gave smaller amounts to other causes. The rest he saved with a discipline that astonished people who knew him. By 20, he had saved $800, a substantial sum for a teenager in 1859. He told a friend years later that his greatest discovery during those early years wasn't a business idea. It was the realization that most people had no real grasp of where their money came from or where it went. They thought they knew. They didn't. The ones who actually wrote it down, every transaction on time, without exception, held a quiet advantage over everyone who didn't. That advantage would compound for the next 70 years. To enter the real business world, he needed more than $800, so he asked the only person with money who would lend it to him, his estranged father. Devil Bill agreed to lend him $1,000, then, true to form, charged his own son 10% interest and warned him he might demand the money back at any moment, without notice, just to keep the boy sharp. John didn't argue. He took the money. He partnered with an older, more experienced produce merchant named Maurice Clark and opened a commission house, buying and selling grain, pork, and beans. The business did well almost immediately. Both partners were disciplined. Clark was older and more experienced. John was younger, but had something Clark didn't: a perfect understanding, at all times, of exactly where every dollar in the business was. In 1859, in a small Pennsylvania town called Titusville, a man named Edwin Drake struck the first commercially viable oil well in American history. The country was suddenly drowning in petroleum. Cleveland, sitting on a perfect rail and water route to the East Coast, became the refining capital of the country almost overnight. John saw the opportunity instantly. Clark didn't. Clark wanted to stay in produce. People will always need to eat, he said. John's answer was simpler. People will always need to see in the dark. In 1863, against Clark's wishes, they brought in a chemist named Samuel Andrews and opened a small refinery. Within 2 years, the refinery had become their main source of profit, and the partners were openly fighting about how to run it. Clark wanted to play it cautious. John wanted to borrow aggressively and expand at every opportunity. By 1865, the partnership couldn't continue. They agreed to settle it the cleanest way available, a private auction. Whichever partner outbid the other would take the entire refinery. The other would walk away. The bidding started at $2,000, then $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. Clark was a careful man. He believed he was bidding against a 25-year-old who couldn't possibly have the capital or the nerve to outbid him. And John said the number that ended Clark's career and started Rockefeller's empire, $72,500. The room went silent. Clark didn't have it. More importantly, Clark realized that the young man across the table from him had been quietly preparing for this exact moment for years. John wasn't going to stop. He would bid himself bankrupt if necessary, because he knew, from the ledger, that the refinery was worth more than either of them had imagined. Clark walked out. John walked into the office he now owned, sat down at the desk, and opened the book. He later said, "That was the day that determined my career." Most refiners at the time were chasing one product, kerosene. They distilled it out of the crude oil, sold it to the lamp market, and dumped everything else, the gasoline, the naphtha, the tar, the wax, straight into the Cleveland River. Rockefeller looked at the river and saw money. A ledger, a mind worked like this. Every drum of crude oil arriving at his refinery had a cost. Every product leaving his refinery had a price. The gap between the two was either profit or waste. Most of his competitors were systematically throwing away 3/4 of every barrel they refined. With Andrews, his chemist, he started building processes to turn the waste streams into products. Gasoline became fuel. Naphtha became cleaning solvent. Tar became asphalt. Paraffin became candle wax and lubricant. Every drop that used to flow into the river now flowed onto a balance sheet. He didn't stop there. He bought his own forests and built his own kilns to dry the wood that became his oil barrels. Eliminating a middleman, he built his own warehouses, his own cooperage shops, his own pipelines, eventually his own railroad tank cars. Every cost his competitors paid to a third party, he paid to himself. This is what people today call vertical integration. To Rockefeller, it was just the next column in the ledger. By 1869, he was the largest refiner in Cleveland, which made him the largest refiner in the world. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller and a handful of associates incorporated the Standard Oil Company. The name was deliberate. They wanted to project quality, consistency, predictability. Then they began the work of swallowing every competitor in the country. The strategy started with the railroads. Rockefeller walked into the offices of the three biggest railroad companies and made them an offer. He would guarantee 60 carloads of oil shipping per day, on schedule, every day of the year. In exchange, he wanted a secret cut on every barrel they shipped, including barrels shipped by his competitors. The arrangement had three teeth. The rebate. Rockefeller paid the published rate per barrel, but the railroad refunded a portion of it back to him in private. The spy network. The railroads gave him detailed reports on every shipment, by every refiner, what was being shipped, by whom, to where, at what price. The drawback. For every barrel a competitor shipped, the railroad took a piece of that competitor's payment and quietly handed it to Rockefeller. This was not a metaphor. His enemies were literally paying him every time they tried to compete with him. Then he started visiting them in person. He'd invite a competitor to his office, calmly lay out the math, and explain that the rates being charged to ship their oil were higher than what Standard was paying after the rebate. "You will go bankrupt if you continue," he'd say. "Or you can sell to me today for fair value in cash or Standard stock." Most of them took the deal. Between February and March of 1872, in a campaign now remembered as the Cleveland Massacre, 22 of the 26 independent refineries in Cleveland were absorbed into Standard Oil. Some held out. The ones who held out didn't last long. The arrangement leaked in March 1872. The public reaction was explosive. The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the charter of the cartel within weeks. Newspapers across the country called Rockefeller a snake. He was hanged in effigy in oil towns. The phrase, the anaconda, a creature that wraps itself around its prey and quietly suffocates it, entered the American vocabulary as a synonym for Standard Oil. It didn't matter. By the time the public found out about the cartel, Rockefeller already owned Cleveland. Killing the cartel didn't unkill the refineries he'd absorbed. The dominoes had already fallen. He moved his attention from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, then to Philadelphia, then to New York, repeating the same strategy. When a group of independent Pennsylvania oilmen tried to build a 110-mile pipeline to ship oil directly to the coast, bypassing the railroads entirely and breaking Rockefeller's grip on transportation, he responded with something close to total war. He bought strips of land across the planned route to halt construction with trespassing lawsuits. He bribed local officials to pull permits. He sabotaged construction sites. When the pipeline finally opened, the companies that had built it were exhausted and broke. He bought the pipeline for almost nothing. By 1879, the Bookkeeper controlled 90% of every drop of oil refined in the United States. Section 9. The Ghost. How they invented the modern corporation. There was now a new problem. American law in the 1870s was simple. A corporation chartered in one state was not allowed to own stock in a corporation chartered in another state. Rockefeller's empire spanned dozens of states. It was a fragile patchwork of secret handshakes and gentlemen's agreements. One legal challenge in the wrong courtroom could collapse the whole thing. So Rockefeller's lawyers invented something that had never existed before. On January 2, 1882, Rockefeller and 8 associates signed a document that pulled the stock of 40 separate companies into a single legal entity controlled by 9 trustees. They called it the trust. It was a legal ghost. If a regulator asked who owned a particular refinery, the answer was a maze of paperwork that didn't lead to a single name. The trust didn't show up on any state corporate registry. It didn't file taxes anywhere as a coherent entity. It just existed, controlling everything from the shadows. A journalist would later write that you could argue the existence of the Standard Oil Trust from its effects on the market, but you could not prove it from any single document. The trust is the legal ancestor of every modern multinational corporation, every shell company structure, every holding company, every offshore subsidiary used by Apple or Amazon or anyone else. They all trace back to the document Rockefeller's lawyers wrote in 1882. Section 10. 39 drops. By the mid-1880s, Rockefeller controlled the global oil trade. Standard Oil was now selling kerosene from Cleveland to Singapore. He gave away free kerosene lamps in rural China. Once a man owned the lamp, he had to keep buying the fuel. Standard's iconic blue 5-gallon tins appeared in markets from Hong Kong to Cairo. He drove the price of kerosene down from 30 cents a gallon to 8. In doing so, he gave the poor of the world the ability, for the first time in human history, to read after dark. But the ledger A mind kept measuring. One day, Rockefeller visited a factory where Standard's kerosene tins were sealed shut with drops of molten solder. He stood and watched the process for a while, then asked the foreman how many drops of solder were used to seal each tin. 40. He told the foreman to try 38. Tins leaked. He told him to try 39. 39 worked. Across the millions and millions of tins Standard Oil shipped every year, that one drop of solder per tin saved the company a fortune. A drop of solder, a fortune. That single moment is Rockefeller's entire mind in miniature. In 1902, a journalist named Ida Tarbell began researching Standard Oil for McClure's magazine. Tarbell was not a neutral party. Decades earlier, her father had been a small independent oil producer in Pennsylvania, and she had watched as Standard Oil systematically destroyed his business and his spirit. She spent 2 years tracking down former Standard employees, unearthing secret contracts, mapping the rebate system, and assembling the proof of the trust's existence that no government had managed to pin down. She published her findings as a serialized exposé in McClure's between 1902 and 1904. It later appeared as a 2-volume book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was, by some accounts, the most damaging piece of journalism in American history. It gave the public a face to hate, and around the same time, the country learned a separate, embarrassing detail about Rockefeller that he had spent his entire adult life hiding. His father, Devil Bill, was still alive, still operating under a fake name in another state, still married to a second woman, still running con games. The richest man in America was the son of a con artist. Rockefeller refused to comment publicly. He retreated to his estates. For the first time in his life, he was losing control of the story. Tarbell's exposé was the political fuel that allowed President Theodore Roosevelt to launch a serious antitrust prosecution against Standard Oil. The case wound through the courts for years. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court delivered the verdict. Standard Oil was declared an unreasonable monopoly. The trust would be dissolved. 34 separate companies would be carved out of it. The public celebrated. Newspapers across the country read headlines declaring the death of the anaconda. Reformers took credit for finally breaking the back of the most hated business in America. Then something strange happened. Rockefeller still owned a massive share of stock in every one of those 34 new companies. The breakup didn't take any equity away from him. It just changed how that equity was structured. And once the individual companies were free of the trust, free to be valued independently, free to pursue their own growth, their stock prices exploded. The world was simultaneously transitioning from kerosene lamps to gasoline-powered automobiles. The oil business was about to enter the biggest growth decade of its history. By 1916, the combined value of Rockefeller's stakes in the 34 spin-offs had grown to over $1 billion. He had officially become the world's first confirmed billionaire at a time when the average American earned $800 a year. The antitrust prosecution, intended to destroy him, had multiplied his fortune roughly sixfold. The newspapers that had cheered the breakup quietly stopped writing about him. In his final decades, Rockefeller did something unexpected. He hired the first generation of professional public relations consultants and rebranded himself as a philanthropist. He started handing out shiny new dimes to children in public appearances, a small, photogenic ritual that played well in the new medium of the newsreel. But the philanthropy went deeper than the staging. He founded the University of Chicago. He created the Rockefeller Foundation. He funded the research that eradicated hookworm in the American South and yellow fever in much of the world. He pioneered the modern model of large-scale charitable giving, one that nearly every billionaire foundation since has copied. Was it genuine? Was it guilt? Was it the final long con of a man who knew history is written by the winners? The honest answer is that we will never know. He never publicly explained himself, and his ledger entries, while precise about the amounts, said nothing about why. He died on May 23, 1937, at the age of 97. His final estate was valued at the equivalent of roughly $24 billion in today's money. Though the foundations he built control far more than that, and the companies that grew out of Standard Oil are now collectively worth trillions. Here is what the conventional story of Rockefeller gets wrong. He wasn't an unusually charismatic leader. He wasn't a particularly daring risk-taker. He wasn't visionary in the way Edison or Ford were. He was something quieter and far more dangerous than any of that. He was a bookkeeper who never stopped looking at the next column. Where his competitors saw waste, he saw revenue. Where they saw shipping costs, he saw negotiating leverage. Where they saw legal limits, he saw paperwork to be redesigned. Where they saw rivalry, he saw an arithmetic problem with one logical solution: absorb everything, measure everything, optimize everything. The real lesson of Rockefeller isn't ruthlessness. There were plenty of ruthless men in his era who died poor. The lesson is precision. In any industry, in any market, in any era, the person who measures most accurately, most consistently, and most ruthlessly will quietly accumulate everything the louder people leave on the table. It started with a 10-cent notebook. If this video held your attention all the way to the end, the best thing you can do is hit the like button. It's how YouTube knows to show this story to more people. And subscribe before you go. New stories from the hidden history of business and money every week. Drop a comment below. Which of Rockefeller's moves was the most ruthless? The railroad rebate, the trust, or the 39 drops of solder? I read every reply. I'll see you in the next one.